You woke? Time to get up. Welcome to Thought You Woke, No Speed Limit Podcast. I'm your host, Alvin. What we do here is we discuss religion, politics, we talk about current events, and we talk about resistance and culture. If you like this, make sure that you share, subscribe, and leave a comment. Now, today I want to get started with our story, and we're going to talk about what's going on in South Africa and with the United States. So, on May 12th, 2025, 59 South Africans landed at Dulles Air Force Base in the U.S. after a charter flight sponsored by the Trump administration brought them over from South Africa. The reasons for this will become clearer later, but first, let us study the history of South Africa and the current situation. South Africa has long been settled by indigenous groups who settled in the region more than 130,000 years ago. Early settlers were the Sand people, also known as the Bushmen, a hunter-gatherer society known for their intricate rock drawings. The Khoikhoi were also early settlers of the land. They were a pastoral group and raised livestock. They also engaged in trade with early African, Asian, and European societies. The two groups are better known as the Khoisan people. The Bantu people would later migrate to the region and become the dominant culture. The Bantu people, whose language uses a unique click sound in the pronunciation, had developed agriculture and ironworking technology, which they also traded with other African, Asian, and European civilizations. These groups soon became the basis for the Xhosa and Zulu nations. These two nations engaged in trade and often traded conflict as well. It wasn't until 1652 that the Dutch came to colonize Africa. The Dutch established a refreshment station for ships that passed through the area. It would soon become a settlement as more Dutch settlers arrived seeking agricultural resources and trade opportunities. The settlement of these new arrivals led to conflicts with indigenous people as settlers made further incursions into Bantu lands. The Dutch also brought with them slaves from Madagascar and other parts of West Africa to work their farms and mines, further complicating racial and cultural conflicts in the centuries to come. The British came to power in the 1800s after taking claim of the Dutch colony during the Napoleonic Wars, again pushing aside the natives that lived there. British rule led to conflicts between the Zulus, Xhosa, and Dutch settlers, known as Boers. In the early 19th century, the British wanted to unify its holdings in South Africa. The South African Act of 1809 established British dominion in South Africa under British control. This new union would prove to be devastating to the indigenous population. Because of conflicts over land rights, cattle, and cultural misunderstandings between Xhosa kingdoms and Dutch and British settlers, this led to several small wars between 1779 and 1879, also known as the Frontier Wars. A new British governor wanted to consolidate all Cape territories under British rule. This meant subduing Africans and their holdings in the Cape. Conflict between Xhosa and local Boer settlers gave the British the excuse to attack the Xhosa. British forces entered Xhosa territory and destroyed not only the Xhosa army, but settlements as well. Once the war ended, the governor wanted to set up a system that favored white settlers over the black indigenous group. The British also wanted to disarm indigenous groups to prevent further conflicts. The conflict with the Zulus was a bloody affair that lasted 6 months. British leaders in 1878 had consolidated most of their territories. However, the Zulu nation had not yet been subdued by the British or the Boers. Under Shaka Zulu, the Zulu nation had expanded its borders and had become a powerful African nation. Skirmishes between Boers, Xhosa, and Zulus had been common events over the years of both Dutch and British settlements. Great Britain decided to take advantage of a territorial dispute between the Zulu and the Xhosa nations to invade the Zulu Empire. A British column invaded Zulu land, burning and destroying Zulu settlements, hoping to engage and destroy Zulu forces. The campaign would prove to be a much more brutal affair than the British anticipated. The Battle of Islandwana Mountain would prove to be a disaster as British forces of 800 men were caught out in the open against 10,000 Zulu warriors. The Zulu force was mostly consisted of warriors with spears and cowhide shields. However, there were a contingent of sharpshooters among the armed with muskets. Though the battle cost the Zulus nearly 4,000 warriors dead or wounded, they managed to destroy the British column, leaving a few survivors. However, such costly battles meant that the poorly equipped Zulus would eventually lose the war to the British, who were not only armed with better rifles, but also the early version of the machine gun, which often used to brutal effect against native colonials. The final treaty divided the Zulu nation into smaller chieftains that made it easier for the British to control. At first, the British, like the Dutch before them, only saw the Cape as a military and shipping outpost. Soon, however, the interest in diamond and gold resources in the Cape would draw British settlers to the area. With the arrival of the British, the Boers moved further inland, forming three independent states: the Orange Free State, the South African Republic, and the short-lived state of Natalia. Between the four European states, the segregation from Africans was made into law, though only loosely enforced. The conflict with the Boer states and British led to two very bloody wars between the British and Boers called the First and Second Boer Wars. The Boers sought independence in the First Boer War and managed to win that conflict. However, the state of Natal did not survive the war. The Second Boer War was over territorial issues. The Boer states were forced to surrender to the British in the Second War. The Boer states were then dissolved back into the British holdings. These two wars devastated not only British and Boer communities, but also heavily affected Africans who were often swept up in the conflict. With the end of the Boer Wars, the British, firmly in control, formed a parliament and union that would govern South Africa until its independence. The new governing body gave little to no representation to the African population, but would control the African population with several acts and enforcement policies. In 1913, the Union Parliament created a Natives Land Act, which limited 13% of the land to the majority indigenous population and prohibited purchase of 93% of the land. White people, who at the time were about 20% of the population, were given 80% of the land. This law also forced blacks to work for white South African farmers. It also forced Africans onto land reserves set aside by the state.
After half a century, the Union of South Africa has withdrawn from the British family of nations. Racial discrimination remains her policy, and she will not apply for continued membership of the Commonwealth. From the burden of apartheid, the colored people out there will not be released.
Well, after World War II, many of the former European colonies began to break away from the European colonizers. South Africa became a nation in 1950 and fully independent by 1961. The only thing, still had the colonizers in control. The Boers still dominated the government despite the black majority. While segregation or apartheid existed since the first settlers came to South Africa, it was not fully enforced. The British colonial government also adopted such policies to prevent further conflict with the Boers. The Boers, who controlled the South African government after independence, would expand upon this by making an apartheid, or apartness as it was called, into law. Prohibition of the Mixed Marriages Act of 1949 under British dominion was the beginning of the apartheid draconian laws that separated white people from all other races in South Africa. The Homeland Act of 1970 would further augment the Native Land Act of 1913. The Homeland Act forced Native people out of urban centers into established homelands or shanty towns owned and controlled by white landowners. These homelands offered little comfort to black Africans and often had no running water, limited electricity, and structures were poorly built. Further acts made it illegal for people of different races and ethnic groups to form business partnerships or even friendships. It was illegal for black people to buy or sell land. It was nearly impossible for Africans to get a proper education or establish a business. The white South African government often supported the efforts of other white settlers to maintain control over African populations. The most infamous of these was the war in the former state of Rhodesia. South Africa gave military and financial support to the white Rhodesian government in its efforts to remain in control of black Africans. It also became involved in the war against Angola, where black rebels were supported by the Cuban military. All the South African efforts ended with defeats in Rhodesia and Angola, however.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people. And I think the time has come for us to consider, in the light of our experiences in this stay at home, whether the methods which we have applied so far are adequate.
Soon, the black Africans established a political resistance movement under the African National Congress, the Pan African Congress, and the Communist Party. At first, the movement was nonviolent. However, the white dominant government sent in the police and the military to violently put down any protest. It was also at this time that the South African government formed military police death squads. They performed secret operations to kill prominent resistance leaders. It is suspected that more than 150 leaders were killed by these death squads. Many other black South Africans were jailed or killed by the military and the police during this time. It was at this moment that one of the most vocal and impactful South African ANC leaders, Nelson Mandela, came to prominence. The black South African movement had also begun to organize violent resistance against the Boer government and committed acts of sabotage. It was under this pretense that Mandela was jailed by the South African government, who labeled him a terrorist. He would remain in and out of jail for the next 27 years. However, imprisoning and torture did not stop the movement nor Mandela. The resistance movement grew worldwide despite the military and police efforts of the South African government.
Our simple message is that sanctions should be maintained. We are saying so because sanctions were introduced for the purpose of dismantling apartheid and of making sure that every South African, black and white, is able to determine his own future.
South Africa had been under a UN embargo since 1966 because of its racist policies, but had established ties with Israel, who helped maintain and support the white South African government during this time. However, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Cold War ending, South Africa's racist regime became the target of international pressure. In 1990, under F.W. de Klerk, Nelson Mandela was freed from jail. Nelson, as head of the ANC, would then work with F.W. de Klerk to end apartheid and draft a new constitution. In 1993, a new constitution would be ratified, ending apartheid in South Africa.
Can we agree, first of all, that expropriation has nothing to do with land reform?
This act is not a land reform law, and the difference is that successful countries, Germany, United States, United Kingdom, Switzerland, South Korea, Japan, etc., all have a very wide degree of deference to owners when expropriating their property. The government says sorry to you by paying you market or above compensation. Now, in South Africa, and this is what I was disagreeing about, is that it's not a small list of circumstances in which the government can now seize your property, confiscate your property without paying you a cent. So if you own fixed property anywhere in the country, a house, a business, a warehouse, a farm, and the government says, we think in the public interest we have to take this without paying you a cent, it is allowed to do that. That is inconsistent with the Constitution.
Okay, so I want to hear from Una here because your view is actually quite different. Not only do you believe that expropriation needs to happen, you think it needs to happen across the board without compensation.
Exactly, that's correct. Because when you trace the history of South Africa, when you look at the situation of South Africa, my good sir was speaking about crime here. Crime is a result of poverty, and poverty was engineered in South Africa and Africa as a whole. What happened is that in 1652, when the settler arrived here, from that period up until the period of 1910, the land of our people was taken away on grounds that no, this land is not used. The other one, they said no, this land it's not being used for anything. So they actually expropriated it without compensation. And actually, when they expropriated it, they were using violence. Okay, that was the nature of colonialism. And then our people ended up in a situation whereby they were forced now to go and work that land. What it did, 65 to 67% of the population of South Africa was allocated to only 7% of the land of South Africa.
Let me just bring our global
The
audience.
aftermath of apartheid left Africans free, but economically unequal to their white counterparts. The new constitution would try to address this by restoring land rights, allowing people to buy and sell land, and reform education. It also ended racist policies which kept black people from government and city resources that would be crucial to their economic and social mobility. However, white Afrikaners to this day still control the economy of South Africa, leaving the indigenous Africans pretty much in the same situation as before. To this day, 7% of white Afrikaner population of South Africa own 70% of the land, leaving only 30% for 75% of black indigenous people. Poverty rate in South Africa is as high as 47%. The government has been in the process of doing land reform, and some of the land that has been taken, only 10% of that has been distributed to anyone. Now, the government is saying that there are several reasons for that. Like one, we were talking about education, giving it to people who would know how to use the land because they feel that that's important. In fact, watch this video.
Okay, I'm hearing Bulelwa behind me here. Are you the one who was muttering?
Yes, he made a statement that there is a blanket expropriation. That is not the case in South Africa. In this new act of 2025, it's more difficult for government to prove that land is expropriated. There are about 7 or 8 stages that the government must prove. So my argument is that there should not be any fear mongering around the Expropriation Act because actually the landowners' rights are even more protected than ever before.
Let me hear from Martin actually, because that's your interpretation. And Martin, you seem to think that the law is actually now contravening the Constitution.
Yeah, absolutely. So the act says that when the government deems it in the public interest, there are examples, but generally in the public interest, the government may take property without paying anything. This specific government has a long history since the 1990s of depriving people of private property. One cannot look at this act in isolation. Look at the safeguards, which of course they are there, and it's better with them there than not there.
So
but it's not.
You've mentioned safeguards. Do you not trust that they will be upheld?
No. I mean, it comes down to these are formalities, and again, it's better that they are there than they aren't. But unfortunately, most South Africans, and that includes relatively wealthy South Africans, do not have the money when they've now parted with their property. There goes the minister with their farm or their warehouse, and now they have to pay a lawyer, they have to go to court, and they have to spend sometimes a decade in court fighting the expropriation to get their market-based compensation or any compensation whatsoever. No one can really afford it except the creme de la creme of the 1%, and very few people fit in that bracket.
Okay, let me
So let's talk about this process. So basically, the Land Reform Act, basically, like I said, it's not just taking land from somebody; it compensates those that it takes the land from. Now, if you go back to what I said about the history of Africa, the land was taken from these black folks without any compensation whatsoever. They were taken from their land and put into these so-called reserves. You can quote them. They're kind of like Indian reservations, where black people were allowed land. They had these homelands outside of cities that were controlled by white people that they would live in. They were not did not have access to city resources, but they were forced to work for these white people. Um, so the questions here is now is that white people are being compensated for land that they're now taking back from them, but the white people are saying they're not getting the proper compensation for the land that's being taken from them. It's kind of like this seesaw of victimization. So the black people who were victimized now are seen as the ones victimizing the white people. Sounds familiar, right? In the United States, there's this whole movement by Donald Trump to say that white people are now the victims of civil rights movement. That white people are the victims of reforms in the United States. Yeah, of voting rights, of education, of all those things that white people are suffering because of reform. And it's not an easy thing. One evil, to fix one evil, it's often going to be painful to somebody. The power structure is going to be painful to somebody. Now, in the process of that, there is a problem in Africa of crime, which
Of
we're
crime,
about to talk about
and
here.
the police test does not back it. There is indeed the challenge of crime, which affect everyone and which the country is responding to. With regards to what you could define as farm murderers, there is a disproportionate number of farm dwellers who are mostly black who are affected also, and about 55 white Afrikaners in the past 4 years, with about more than 150 farm dwellers who are black who have been affected. So then the data, the evidence.
Due to several issues here, high poverty, government corruption, and cultural issues in South Africa, crime is at an all-time high. In 2024, 7,000 persons were killed of all races. 21 white farmers were killed, and another 55 African farmhands were killed. White murderers account for less than 1% of all murders in South Africa. Gang violence in major cities and poverty-stricken townships account for the largest crime issues in South Africa. Now, townships that we're talking about where black people live, they have limited resources. In fact, some people don't even have running water. They have outhouses and things like that. But this is just a look at the raw numbers surrounding the issue of farm. But this is just a look at the new. While the numbers of farmers killed is quite low, we must remember the history and current events show that there is a level of racial tension in South Africa. Some farm attacks aren't even committed by South Africans. Still, there is an element of the crime that is internally motivated. In other words, there is some things that are caused by the past, by the history, by the anger of people. In other words, farmers killing farmers. There is, after all, a long history of racial tension, not only in South Africa, but surrounding countries as well. Still, many times murders happen because of simple robberies gone wrong, victims fighting back, and or the attacker gets nervous, something like that. All of these things are a factor here. But the fact that there's a disproportionate number of black people committing the crime has a part of that to do with the population. Most of the population of the poor, which is where crime happens to be black in South Africa. Is this a sign of a problem with farmers? Well, we'll see.
We have thousands of stories talking about it, and we have documentaries, we have news stories. And is Natalie here? Somebody here to turn that? I could show you a couple of things, and I have to. It has to be responded to. Yeah, sure. Let me see the articles, please, if you would. And turn the lights down. Turn the lights down, and just put this on. It's right behind you. We don't care. You can do whatever you want to do. Who are you to tell us what okay to occupy land or not? We are going to occupy land. South African occupy land. That's who we are. Never be scared to kill. A revolution demands that at some point there must be killing because the killing is part of the revolutionary act. Now this is very bad. These are burial sites right here. Burial sites
over 1,000 of white farmers, and those cars are lined up to pay love on a Sunday morning. Each one of those white things you see is a cross, and there's approximately 1,000 of them. They're all white farmers, the family of white farmers. And those cars aren't driving, they're stopped there to pay respects to their family member who was killed. And it's a terrible sight. I've never seen anything like it. Both sides of the road
Now,
give.
high poverty and the slowness of land reform have given rise to radical leaders among the poor and working poor. The most vocal of these leaders is Julius Malema, aka Juju. Juju is the leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters Party. He was once a member of the ANC but was expelled due to his radical beliefs. EFF and Juju have demanded that all land should be confiscated from whites and returned to black Africans without compensation. He has stated at times that violence should be used to implement this if necessary. Juju has been jailed twice for hate speech and singing an anti-Boer song, which I didn't show here in the video. The EFF holds between 7% and 11% in the South African parliament, which is still dominated by the ANC for the most part. Now, the power of the ANC has waned since 1996. The EFF considers itself the inheritor of the ANC radical policies. According to the Trump administration, the 59 white South African individuals are escaping genocide of white South African farmers and the confiscation of their lands by South African government. South Africa's officials have denied that there has been any such genocide, but have admitted a high number of murders, including mostly black South Africans. Now, President Trump has also frozen the South African assets and aid to South Africa over land reform law in the South African Constitution. Elon Musk, former leader of Doge, this is a minor side note, and citizen of South Africa, the U.S. and Canada, is also in favor of Trump's actions. And as I said before, there's the whole notion that there is land reform because the high number of Africans in the area do not have access to land. History tries to tell us that the Bantu people arrived about around the same time um, as the Dutch, who then tried to say, well, the Bantu moved in on the Khoisan people, took over their land while we were there, and there was land that just wasn't being used, and we just took the land that wasn't being used. But later on, here we are making laws to keep the Bantu people. You fought wars with the Zulus and the Bantus to keep them from having the land that you say they shouldn't have in the first place. And instead of like working together and saying, "Hey, can we have this land? Will you move here?" or so on and so forth, you decide to fight over it, and then when you took it over, you just push those people out of the way. And so then we get to an issue of what's happening now. Sure, some of the murders are racially motivated. Some of them are ethnically motivated. That's true. Are they a genocide? I don't think so. Again, I'm seeing a sign here of issues of crime. And to tell you the story of those white crosses,
President Trump touched on was a video that was taken from the sky in a helicopter, and it showed a road and crosses on either side of this road as hundreds, if not thousands, of vehicles lined this road. Now, that video was taken in September 2020. It was taken on a rural road in the Normandine area, which is in northern KwaZulu-Natal, in an area known as Newcastle. And that video was taken in response to a murder that was committed earlier that week. But on that specific protest you saw in the video, right, was a multiracial protest. According to the Institute for Race Relations, who were there on the day of the protest took place the following weekend on September the 5th, the Saturday. And this was in response to people trying to make government aware of the plight of farmers in the country and trying to raise awareness around farm murders. Now, Glenn and Vito were murdered on August 30th, on the Sunday. On Wednesday, September 2nd, the former Minister for Police, Bheki Cele, together with Fani Masimola, met with the Rafferty family in Normandy. I was there. I was a reporter in KwaZulu-Natal at the time. I attended that meeting that Cele had with the family, as well as an open engagement and dialogue that he had with farmers as well as farm workers in the community. Seriously? So there's claims that each cross on either side of the road represent people who were murdered in farm attacks. That's not the case. The organizers who the Institute for Race Relations spoke to at the time said they were merely just trying to raise awareness. And those crosses were just trying to raise attention as to the plight of farm workers and the dangerous conditions they live in.
So see here, the video that Trump had was actually incorrect. And if you watch this gentleman's video further, he'll talk about some of those articles that Trump had. Some of them were from not reputable sources, and also one of those particular articles he was holding in his hand wasn't even from South Africa. But that's beside the point. What the point that I want to make here is this: that two things. One, during the entire time of apartheid and the political turmoil that was happening, the United States avoided helping people in South Africa. Now, because there are land reforms going on and there's some turbulence, and I'm going to call it what it is, turbulence in the reform where some people are losing their lands. There's economic shakeup in South Africa. It's still struggling economically. And that these people happen to be white when we have a administration that is keen on protecting whiteness, white nationalism. We like again, I said this has to take a look at what's happening in Africa and remember what's happening in the United States. We've had the history of slavery. We had the reservations that the Native Americans have been shifted to here in the United States. We have our own history of problems. As far as Juju or this Julius Anima, this man here in the EFF, they are no more radical than, let's say, the Ku Klux Klan or the neo-Nazis are here. Yet the neo-Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan are allowed to freely march here in the United States. Are they not? Now, are they in our government? Are they taking land over there in Africa? No, Juju is not taking. This man is not allowed to take land or kill people or do any of those things, and he is not doing any of those things. Yet he has spoken of reform. The reform he spoke of was also the reform that you heard the other young gentleman speak of earlier, where we take all the land, give it to the chiefs, and let the chiefs distribute it out to everybody. Now that we're not doing that, the government says we're not going to do that. No, we're going to set up a reform system where everybody will be treated fairly. So there are different versions of things going on, and then some white people say that that this isn't fair, that they're not getting properly compensated, or that when they lose their land, then they're in a bad economic situation. Can I be honest with you? Nobody's going to like what's going to happen because a lot of things have to be fixed and a lot of things are not in good shape. It is not going to be the best for everybody. It's not going to be best for the black Africans. It's not going to be best for the colored people and other people that live among the Africans. It's definitely not going to be good for the white people. There's going to be upheavals. There's going to be changes of lifestyle. This happens. We can't make things perfect for everybody. But back to the United States and Donald Trump. Donald Trump has infused himself in a situation that he has no idea what's really going on. He's picked these articles up. He's taken this video totally out of context and decided to say that we need to help South Africans. We brought them here, and this is what we need to do. Now, before I go, I want you to see this video of our Secretary of State before Congress.
Mr. Secretary, I want to ask you about the program. It's the United States Refugee Assistance Program, and this is a program that state is the manager of, but together with other cabinet secretariats, DHS and HHS, state plays the lead management role, and it is how to manage the U.S. refugee assistance programs in tandem with contractors who helped the United States on that. By an executive order on the first day of his presidency, President Trump paused all refugee programs and has canceled contracts to the agencies like the U.S. Catholic Church or Lutheran Refugee Services or HIAS or Church World Services who've been resettling refugees. Those programs are paused. There's litigation about it, but as far as I know, the United States is not, or the administration has not withdrawn the executive order. So there's essentially from this administration no refugee programs for anyone except. In early February, the president announced a special refugee program for Afrikaner farmers, justified A, by some concerns about South African foreign policy, but B, a claim that these were persecuted individuals. So right now, the U.S. refugee program allows a special program for Afrikaner farmers, the first group of whom arrived at Dulles Airport in Virginia not long ago, while shutting off the refugee program for everyone else. Do you think Afrikaner farmers are the most persecuted group in the world?
I think those 49 people that came certainly felt they were persecuted, and they've passed every sort of check mark that had to be checked off in terms of meeting the requirements for that. They live in a country where farms are taken and land is taken on a racial basis.
Okay. Do you think they're more persecuted than Uyghurs or Rohingyas, or more persecuted than political dissidents in Cuba or Venezuela or Nicaragua, or more persecuted than those who would be threatened should they be returned to Afghanistan by violence by the Taliban?
Well, the problem we face there is the volume problem. Okay, if you look at all the persecuted people of the world, it's millions of people. They can't all come here. And we had refugee programs.
So why prioritize Afrikaner farmers?
Well, because it's a small subset. It's a new issue, and the president identified it as a problem and wanted to use it as an example. But that's different from having these refugee programs that were basically spending money to put people up in communities and accommodate them, and it was acting as a magnet. Millions of people in the country illegally, and today the border is sealed.
Let me challenge you, and I'm just going to say for the public, if you want to understand about the, quote, persecution of Afrikaner farmers, go look at the composition of the South African government. Since July of 2024, there's a government of national unity, and the opposition party to the ANC, the Afrikaner Party, the Democracy Alliance, is part of the governing coalition. They joined the governing coalition a year ago, and the leader of that party was given the remit of Agriculture Minister, John Steenhuisen. He is the leader of the former Afrikaner Party, still widely representing Afrikaners. He is the Minister of Agriculture in South Africa right now. I assert that this claim that there's persecution of Afrikaner farmers is completely specious. Are you aware ever during the apartheid era in South Africa did the United States establish a special program to allow South African blacks who were treated as second-class citizens in the apartheid program, a special program so they could claim refugee status in the United States?
No, because I was probably in 9th grade or 8th grade at the time.
Well, then I don't expect you to know. I'll just tell you, never has there been a special program for Africans to come in as refugees to the United States. We've allowed special programs for people being persecuted for their religion, Soviet-era Jews. We've allowed special programs for people fleeing from communism, Cuba, Vietnam, the Soviet Union. We've never allowed a special program to allow Africans into the United States in an expedited refugee status until now. Afrikaner farmers living in a nation governed by a government of national unity that includes the main Afrikaner Party. And actually, an even more right-wing Afrikaner Party is also included in the coalition government. Now, would you agree with me, Mr. Secretary, that if we're interpreting the statutory phrase, a well-justified fear of persecution, we should try to do that in an even-handed way?
I think we should try to do that.
To be honest with you, I think he pretty much said it all. I don't have to say much, but I will say this. I live in a country where Venezuelans, Mexicans, Haitians, Africans, people of color are all right now being rounded up and shipped out of the country. Meanwhile, we've decided to categorize a special group of people who come from a country who has a long history, and maybe this is wrong for me to say this, but they are the descendants of the colonizers who entered into Africa, who uprooted the indigenous people through force, through war, through apartheid system. And now they're the victims of their own hegemony, their own creation. They created apartheid. Now the apartheid's gone. It protected them from what would have happened naturally anyway if the majority population was there. They would be reduced to as the minority, protected as the minority. If there's one thing in the United States that we have a problem with, it's this thing called the replacement theory. A lot of white people, of conservative white people, I'm gonna say every American, this is not true. Even Donald Trump have fallen for this idea of the replacement theory, that these immigrants are here to replace them. As the white population falls off because of negative birth rates, which is of no fault of the immigrants of the United States or liberal parties, they are not eating babies, as the QAnon folks would say. American men and women, white men and women, fear being in the minority in a country in which they have segregated people, in which they have at one point enslaved people, which they have put people on reservations. They fear being a minority in a country where they feel that there will be retribution for all of the things that they have done. Folks, I'm all out of time. This has been a long video. I hope that what I put together here has made a lot of sense to you so that you can understand what's really going on. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, and please leave.
You have been listening to Thought You're Woke, No Speed Limit Podcast.